so honored to have here with us tonight Meg Muckenhoupt, author of The Truth About Baked Beans. Meg is a freelance writer and author of Cabbage, A Global History, among others. Her work has been featured in the Boston Globe, the Boston Phoenix, Boston Magazine, and Time Out Boston Guide. Her book, Boston Gardens and Green Spaces, is a Boston Globe local bestseller. As for Meg's new book, The Truth About Baked Beans explores New England's culinary myths and the reality through some of the region's most famous foods: baked beans, brown bread, clams, cod and lobster, maple syrup, pies, and Yankee pot roast. This toothsome volume reveals the effort that went into the creation of these foods and lets us begin to reclaim the culinary heritage of immigrant New England. The French Canadians, Irish, Italians, Portuguese, Polish, Indigenous people, African Americans, and other New Englanders whose culinary contributions were erased from these versions of New England foods. So it is my pleasure to have with us tonight, Meg Muckenhoupt.
Hi, everybody. Yes, some of you have observed I have the studio audience behind me who will be assisting me during this presentation. I'm Meg Muckenhoupt, the author of The Truth About Baked Beans, and we're going to talk about a couple of different things tonight. But before we start, I want to give a couple of disclaimers. First of all, this book is not just about beans. As a wonderful interlocutor just said, there's also boiled dinner, pie, donuts, lobster, cod, apples, other stuff, and there are even recipes in the middle. You can make stuff with this book. It's wonderful. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about culture before I get into this. Some of you people tuning in today probably grew up in New England. I didn't. I was removed to New Jersey for the first 16 years of my life. It was no fault of my own. I had no influence, but I moved back here. My family has actually been in the States since 1630, okay? So you want to talk white people culture? I know this. But I wasn't raised in New England culture per se. We didn't big bean hole pits. We didn't eat codfish every Saturday. Some of you did. I respect your traditions, but what I'm going to talk about today is how those traditions developed and how they might not be exactly what New England is today. They may not be the traditions that we want to advertise to everyone in the world as this is what New England is. And it may tell a story about the people who live and work and cook in New England that may not be what we want to project to the world today. I wrote this book because I want to understand a little bit more about regional identity, our sense of who we are, who New England is, and how that is expressed through food, and maybe help cooks and eaters and tourism workers and all of us come to a fuller, broader, larger understanding of ourselves and our past. Your experiences may have mirrored what the foods I'm going to talk about today, but maybe they didn't. And we're going to talk about different possibilities, different options, different ways to be. And we're going to talk about beans. And I'm going to try and summarize part of this book for you in a half hour, which is really hard because it's a couple hundred pages long. So let's go. And I'm going to go back and forth sharing screen and talking so that you get a full multi-sensory experience. It'll be exciting. All right, let's share that screen. So here we are in The Truth About Baked Beans. Wouldn't you like to know the truth about baked beans? I bet you would. So this book began with two questions. One, who thought of gulling molasses into a pot of baked beans in the first place? What was that about? How did we come up with a sweet dish as one of the standard main courses in New England? And that led me to the question of what is New England food? And what I'm going to do tonight is talk a little bit about how you define food for a region, if there is a region, if the region actually exists as a real thing, and how we demonstrate that problem through baked beans. And to do that, I'm going to start off with the question of what is in your pantry? And we are going to go back, if I can figure out how to stop sharing screens, yes, and talk a little bit about that. So I live in New England. My children live in New England. Lots of people live in New England. And no, New Jersey does not count as New England. If whoever asked that right now, it's part of the Mid-Atlantic region. It was settled by different people at different time, different culture. Don't talk to me about it, talk to Wikipedia, okay? I lived through my pantry. I thought, I live in New England. I'm probably have New England food. I live here, I eat here, I have ancestors from here. I'm a town meeting member, which is about as New Englandly as you can get. What do we got? So I decided to start taking out New England regional foods to my pantry. And I found Carolina Gold barbecue sauce, very yummy. Carolina barbecue and barbecue from the South in general is eaten all over the country. People love it. You can find barbecue, Blue Ribbon Barbecue. You can find Red Bones Barbecue in Davis Square. There are barbecue places all over Boston. Didn't originate here. That's okay. We eat it. Regional food that's popular. I found spaghetti sauce from New Jersey. Yeah, Italians. You've all watched Jersey Shore. New York, New Jersey area Italian food is eaten all around the place. There are New York pizza places in several states. It's celebrated. It's something people eat. I found Louisiana hot sauce. Yay! Louisiana, Cajun. Great food. People eat it all over the place. Wonderful stuff. Jambalaya, gumbo. Louisiana kitchens everywhere. Great. I kept looking. It's okay. There must be something New Englandy here. We found Chipotle's, Tex-Mex food. Everybody loves it. All over the place. You can buy nachos in movie theaters. I found River Queen peanuts, which are produced by the makers of Teddy peanut butter, but they name themselves after somewhere else in the United States. And of course, the peanuts come from the South. You can't grow them up here because our growing season is too short. And I kept going a little bit more. I did eventually find something from Massachusetts. Oh, look, here's salmon from Alaska. The Pacific Northwest is known for its seafood, which is eaten all over the United States. And I kept looking, and I kept trying to find something from here. Let's see, we had hippie food from Dr. Bragg's liquid aminos apple cider, very, very California. California raisins. And I kept on looking. No raw Newman. I do not have any fluff. My children are too old for that, or at least I think they are. Okay, I'm sorry. You're fluff deprived. Life goes on. I eventually found this wonderful Invisible Cities apiary raw honey, Massachusetts wildflower, hyper local, good for you, good for the environment, buy local, it's great. What struck me looking through my food is that there's regional food all over the United States. There's Tex-Mex, there's poke bowls, there's gooey butter cake, there's chili and gumbo, red beans and rice, fried chicken that represent different cultures and different regions that are eaten all over the place. They've sort of fanned out and expanded all over the United States, and people love it and enjoy this food. And then I thought about, okay, what has New England given to the world for food? And I'm going to share with you a little list, one of the many lists that you find if you Google New England food on Google, because where else would you Google something? Just a moment. Okay. So here's a pretty typical set of New England foods you're going to find. This is actually the top result on Google as of today, even though it says April 29th, 2020. You got lobster rolls. Lobster, that's lovely. They make them in McDonald's in the summer around here. Fried clams, sure. I ate them in New Jersey at Howard Johnson's when I was growing up, but let's give it to them. Indian pudding. Okay. I don't know anybody who makes Indian pudding very often. I can't remember the last time I ate it. I remember they used to serve it at Durgan Park, but Durgan Park closed last year. Doesn't seem all that common. You can't really find it in restaurants all that much. Clam cakes, sure, they serve them on the beach in Newport. And chowder, well, Legal Seafood serves that at Terminal C in Logan, so it must be authentic. Johnny cakes. I'd love to make Johnny cakes, but they don't actually sell the white flint cornmeal in my supermarket for making them, so maybe that's a very local thing. Boston baked beans, full of that molasses goodness. And boiled dinner. You may know boiled dinner as just pot roast. That's what it's called in the rest of the United States. But, none of these things, apart from maybe fried clams, seem to have really expanded beyond New England into a franchise. We don't have the, Providence Roadhouse out there serving food all over the States. We don't really seem to be all that popular in the United States, and we don't necessarily seem to have foods that's all that popular here. In fact, a lot of this stuff is things that people don't seem to eat at all anymore, especially things like Indian pudding and maybe boiled dinner. So I started wondering about that. How often have I eaten this stuff? How often did I eat it in the past year? And if this stuff is really not that popular, why is this supposed to be New England food? Why is this supposed to represent us as a cuisine? And I'm not the only person who has thought this, because I'll show you a headline I found from 2018, a little while ago. Just a moment. Switching back and forth is annoying. Okay, so. Sorry. Let me just play this. Here's one person's opinion about New England food.
Where is everyone?
Who knows? Maybe they finally figured out clam chowder is disgusting because it's basically a savory latte with bugs in it.
So, not everybody enjoys New England food. And here's a headline from a couple years ago. Why don't New Englanders like New England cuisine? Regional cuisines everywhere from Copenhagen to California have gotten modern makeovers. Why is Yankee food still stuck in the past? And that's actually a very good question. Why is it stuck in the past? Why do we seem to continue to promote, and our tourist boards promote, and our convention bureaus promote, and cookbooks continue to promote food that is stuff that people may eat once in a while, but it isn't something that people really like that much? Doesn't seem all that popular, and it's kind of hard to find. You know, many people don't ever bother to make baked beans. They just take them out of a can when you want to. So here I'm going to talk about the case of Boston baked beans. And first off, I just want to show you one measure of just how popular Boston baked beans are. Allrecipes.com has a video channel, and their most popular recipes get 5 million views. Here's a recipe for Boston baked beans that was put out 8 years ago that only has 78,000 views, and they have 1.5 million subscribers. Poor beans, nobody likes them. Okay, so what I would like to do is read you a little story I found when I was wondering about baked beans and why anybody was eating them. So if you look for something like baked bean story or baked bean history on the interwebs, what you find is something like what I found when I searched for it, which is this. The Indians pit-cooked their beans in maple sugar and included a lump of bear fat. The New Englanders replaced the maple sugar with molasses, the bear fat with salt pork, and retained the basic principle of slow cooking. This is the story that's currently in Wikipedia. It's in a book called Eating in America, A History. It's in the story behind the dish, Classic American Foods. And it seems to be what people accept as how we got the molasses in there. Why are they sweet? Well, because the Indians made it sweet. It's too bad it doesn't seem to be true. Any of it. Well, sorry. There's one fact in that which is true. And I'm going to tell you what it is in a minute or two. But first, I want to talk for a moment about fake lore. This is a term that I learned from Sandra Oliver, who is a wonderful food historian. You should read everything that she writes. And it's about folklore that's fake, things that people make up for some reason. In the case of New England food, a lot of the stranger stories about it seem to have been created around the bicentennial year to give an explanation as to why we have these foods in New England by people who either weren't capable of researching where they came from or didn't want to, or, you know, maybe they were just lazy. I don't know. One classic example of fake lore that you've probably heard about before is the idea that apprentices were fed lobster so often that they had it banned. There was a law against serving lobster more than twice a week. Well, that's quite impressive that there could be so much lobster, which we think of as a luxury good, served to apprentices, that they would get sick of it, except that if you start looking, you can never actually find any place or time where this law existed. It was always, oh, sometime that last century. Oh, some town somewhere in the state. The same story has been told about shad and about Atlantic salmon and about heath hens and a variety of other foods. They all have the same story, that apprentices or slaves or students, somebody who was trapped, was fed this stuff so often that there was a law against it. And you can actually trace this story back to 19th century Britain. There was actually a prize given by one of the Royal Societies if anybody could actually track down where and when there was a law against serving apprentices and indentured services salmon, because that was where that story was. They offered a fairly substantial prize. I think it was £100 at the time per year, and no one took it. Nobody could find out any place this happened. Now, why would somebody tell a story like that? Why would it seem to be true? In the case of lobsters, you're talking about a feeling of loss. And in New England during the 19th century, there was a big loss of lobsters. They became much, much less common because people were eating them all the time. There were huge lobster canneries set up in Maine. They're basically fished out off the shore of Connecticut and Massachusetts to a large extent. You know, one of the reasons people associate lobster with Maine is because they basically ate most of the ones that were in the southern states when people first arrived here from Europe. Now, in the case of beans, I think that the fake lore was invented to make it seem like there was a connection to the land. You know, it's never the early colonists invented this. It's the Indians, as though the early colonists were always friends to people and happened to have potlucks and share cooking tips about how to put beans together. There isn't much evidence of this, and I'm going to go over a little bit about why some of this is really questionable. So let me do our share screen again. Show you some pretty pictures. All right. So here is our pretty maples in Vermont in the fall. Aren't they lovely? They're so lovely. They're all second growth forest after people in Vermont stripped down the trees for a variety of reasons to accommodate merino sheep, whose wool was more profitable than having forested hillsides between 1820 and 1840, and then after for timber booms at various times. But now maples have grown back. They're very pretty. This is a place where sugar maples grow. This is a place where it's easy to make maple syrup. You know, it's high altitude, it's cold, you get the right sort of weather in February so that the sap comes up during the day and then down during the night. It's not clear how much maple syrup was made south of there before about 1660, okay? There's evidence that someone was making maple syrup in Massachusetts by 1660. There's some writing by a European guy. And let me just see really quickly that the writings of Europeans are not the only evidence that matters. They're not the only evidence that is true. There are oral histories by people of this time that were not written down. However, there aren't that many oral histories pointing to people south of Vermont were making maple syrup and mixing it into beans before 1675 or so. And sugar was a big deal. Sugar was a very big deal. Sweeteners were a very big deal during colonial times because it was hard to get sweeteners. Up until the 1650s or so, sugar was very expensive in the colonies. There weren't any honeybees north of Virginia until 1630. There wasn't much sugar. People didn't talk about having maple syrup or maple sugar. They talked about what a great gift it was to get things like a rundlet of sugar, a few dozen pounds, as a gift from the governor of the Dutch colonies. There were many people who remarked on how little sweetness there was in the cuisine of the Narragansett and various other peoples they met. By the way, the peoples who lived here before the Europeans colonized weren't just the Indians. They had names. They belonged to different groups and tribes. They spoke a language called Algonquin. So anything that doesn't specify who or when is probably fake lore, or at least not making an effort to really understand who was here. What happened in the 1640s also makes this whole question of the Indians put maple syrup in their beans a little bit tricky. There was a big increase in maple syrup production in the United States after the 1640s, which coincidentally was when a lot of farmers left Barbados. They were driven out by the big sugar firms that were basically buying up all the land. So if you were, a guy only had 5 or 10 acres who was trying to make sugar, you left. And about 1,200 of these people came to Massachusetts. And strangely enough, about a decade later, there was a lot of maple syrup making in the area. It's not clear who taught whom, but certainly having expertise in boiling down vats of brown sweet liquid into sugar and syrup may have helped spur maple syrup making. So from all evidence we have of people talking about how people ate, there wasn't a lot of sweet stuff going around in the colonies when the white people first started, having coffee clutches with the people already living here. And if they had maple syrup and maple sweeteners, it would have been distinctive, it would have been noted, and I'm not sure they would have poured it into a bunch of beans. In fact, the Europeans weren't putting their maple syrup into beans either. I looked up recipes, farmer almanacs, and things like that to see what were people putting in beans and when. When did molasses come in? And I looked over a bunch of cookbooks. The earliest reference I could find to a written recipe for baked beans was about 1825, where the writer said, oh, put a tablespoon of molasses in your beans and it will give them a lovely color. She was talking about a tablespoon of molasses in 2 quarts of beans, dry beans, okay? 2 quarts of dry beans make a lot of beans, huge tracts of beans. And if you look at the ratio of molasses to beans in that recipe, it's about 1%. I'm going to share my screen again to show you a little graphic I made of recipes from cookbooks and farmers magazines and other stuff that I could get my hands on to show you what the ratios of molasses looked like by decades in the latter part of the 19th century and the 20th century. Here we go, sharing the screen again. Yeah! All right, here we are. So around 1880, 1889, when you find recipes for baked beans, they're like, a little bit of sugar, then it goes up, then it goes up, it goes down during World War I, it goes up, it goes up, it goes up. The ones I found in the past decade or 2 decades, which are from places like Cook's Illustrated and Martha Stewart and the Food Network, have astonishing amounts of sugar and molasses in them. They're like 1/3 of the weight of beans. So this basically mirrors how much sweetener Americans in general have been eating over the past few decades. The molasses being added to beans seems to have come in the latter part of the 19th century, and it seems to have accelerated in this century. And it doesn't really seem to have been part of any interaction between Native Americans of whatever tribe and European people at all. So why do we have this story? Oh, I forgot to tell you, there is one true part of that little story about how you make baked beans, and that is that probably whoever was baking beans back then, if they were baking beans, probably did use bear fat. Everybody likes fat bears. This is the winner of the Fat Bear Week contest in Katmai National Park last year. Her name is 435 Holly, and she is a totally excellent bear. So why? Why do we make up these stories about how beans developed? I mean, why not just say, well, after the Civil War, people started putting molasses in beans? Why do we have to have this story about Native Americans, about sharing bear fats and maple syrup? Why do we make these things up? I think it's connected to how the identity of New England was constructed in the late 19th century. And I can point to some different parts of evidence that put back to that. And I'm just going to show you a couple of illustrations of that. So here we are with the New England kitchen in the olden time. So, things are going the wrong way. No. Hang on, we are going the wrong direction in this presentation. It is going the wrong way, so. Okay, here we are. Okay. This is an illustration from a textbook for children in 1878, which looks exceedingly similar to this illustration from the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. This is the Ye Olde New England kitchen. If you've gone to different amusement parks, you may find something like the old-timey hillbilly cottage up there. You got kind of ramshackle kind of timbers, good old grandpa chewing on a straw in the corner somewhere, maybe somebody whittling. That's what we had for New England in the last 40 years of the 19th century. Basically, there was this idea of New England as a theme park, which became very popular around the time of the Civil War and continued through the through until about 1900 or so. You would have these exhibitions set up at centennial expositions, at church fairs. There was one from the Brookline Sanitary Fair to raise money to support the Union side of the Civil War. And they would feature signs of New England industry. They would have a spinning wheel and a butter churn, you can see, and fresh cream. They would have all sorts of things being stored, being hung from the ceiling. They would have shiny pewter platters on the wall. Bellows, things to remind people of the past, of New England as this pristine place full of clean living and clean food. Food that was bland, food that was not spiced, like the stuff that was being eaten by the immigrants who started coming to America in very large numbers after the Civil War. Food that was made very simply for large numbers of people. If you look at the menus for these exhibitions, a lot of them look like the stuff that's still on list of New England foods today. It's basically fast food that you can make in a kettle to serve a bunch of people. Different types of creamy soups or mush, sometimes creamed codfish, donuts. Unfortunately, donuts are not on nearly enough New England food lists. But, you know, it was selected to be easy to serve to groups, not because it represented what people were eating in New England at the time, not what they wanted to eat, but things that seemed like they were primitive and pure enough to be part of this kitchen. And these things were incredibly popular. You know, hundreds, thousands of people went to these places. And this is one way that the idea of New England was sort of codified in the public idea of what New England should be like. It should look like this. It should look like what we think white people did back in the 19th century when they were having a bean pot hanging over the fire, and a little boy would come running in, probably to talk about whatever Bible verses he learned in school that day. You know, a place of purity. This isn't really what New England was like at the time. New England in the late 19th century looked more like this. This is the Waltham Watch Factory with lots of people getting ready to work. Massachusetts in 1900 had the highest proportion of foreign-born residents in the United States. Rhode Island matched it. It was about 30% of people were born somewhere other than the United States. They might have been born in Quebec or Ireland or Poland or Italy or Greece, dozens of countries. And these people were not sitting at home making baked beans because, as you can see in the Waltham system, the women were at work. By 1900, 70% of people in New England lived in cities. 88% of Rhode Island, 86% of Massachusetts, 60% of Connecticut residents lived in urban areas. They were not cooking, you know, homely parsnips over a stove, open fireplace in ye olde kitchen. They were cooking in tenements. They were cooking over stoves they used for heating. They were cooking things that cooked fast when they got home from work. They were doing things like frying chops, you know, buying store-made bread, which is a whole other topic of what reformers thought about that in the 19th century. They were cooking things that were special to their families and their cultures for special occasions, but from day to day, they were not making mush. And this topic was deeply offensive to some New Englanders who had large influence over what people thought about New England and what they thought New England food should be. Here's one of them. This is Ellen Swallow Richards. She was a formidable woman. She was the first, either the first or one of the first women graduates of MIT. She went and continued graduate work, but MIT wouldn't give doctorates to women. She was a chemist, and she was interested in public hygiene and things like improving the water system, but also improving the diets of poor immigrants living in Boston. And the way she thought she would improve the diets was by opening New England kitchens to serve them food so they didn't have to cook at home, which was a good idea because a lot of people didn't really have anywhere to cook in the cheap housing they were living in. And what she cooked was, well, it was mush. It was mush. It was completely mush. It was things like pea soup, clam and corn chowder, succotash, creamed codfish, corn mush, boiled hominy, oatmeal mush, cracked wheat, baked beans, and Indian pudding. These were things that Ms. Richards approved because they fit the nutritional ideals at the time. So you have to remember that vitamins hadn't been discovered yet when she was setting these up in the 1890s to serve immigrants. people knew about fats and proteins and starches, but vegetables, I mean, they tasted good, but they didn't really provide you with the energy you needed to survive. So when Ellen Swallow Richards and her cohorts were trying to come up with foods to feed poor people that they might be able to cook for themselves to save money, remember, they wanted to be able to live better on very little money as opposed to, say, advocating for unions or increasing wages. They came up with these things that were starchy and fatty and heavy as all get out. And these weren't very popular with the immigrants. These kitchens closed. There was one in the North End where Boston's Italian population lived. It was not very popular with the ladies. There was also one in JP where other immigrants lived. And there's a story that Ellen Richards tells in one of her reports about these kitchens, that she tried to hoist off a pail of Indian pudding on a young Irish boy. And he says, no, I'd rather eat what I'd rather. If you were coming to New England to work in a factory, your life wasn't great during the day. That watch factory, not comfortable, loud, noisy, dusty, hot in the summer, cold in the winter. It's an unpleasant life. One of the few things you could do if you were living in New England, late 19th century, is buy the food that you want with the money that you get working in a factory. People bought meat. They bought lumps of meat, chops, and they fried them up, and they ate big lumps of them when they could. A lot of people couldn't afford it, but a lot of people wanted to. The idea of spending time at home stirring a bunch of bland pea soup because economical wasn't that appealing. It wasn't fun. Why bother? Why skimp on one more thing in your life when you've skimped on so much already? But Ellen Swallow Richards went on to found the American Home Economics Association. She was instrumental in creating curricula for the entire United States for women learning home economics, or basically all the cooking schools in the United States that went through the public schools and colleges. Her ideas of what was healthful, which was bland and pale, was spread all over the United States. There's some horrible stories, I guess they thought they were good at the time, of women in New Mexico from various, they must have been Diné, but I'm not really sure actually because it was poorly written. People from a rich land of chiles and tortillas being taught to make creamed codfish as their culinary education. There's stories of African-American women in Georgia being taught to make biscuits with white sauce as their culinary education. Again, people coming from very rich local culinary traditions being taught that this is the correct food to make, correct food to eat. And it's associated with people coming out of New England with the food that New Englanders eat because we are more correct and special than anyone else. This also affected the Boston Cooking School Cookbook, which you may know as the Fannie Farmer Cookbook, which was one of the most popular, the first really popular cookbooks in America that was an innovation because it had strict measurements, add a half cup as opposed to, butter the size of an egg to a recipe. You could actually follow them if you didn't know anything about cooking. And the 1912 Fannie Farmer Cookbook features not only Indian pudding, but mock Indian pudding if you don't happen to have the sufficient corn, milk, and molasses to boil to death in a bag to serve to your family. I don't know anyone who's ever eaten mock Indian pudding. I don't know anyone who's ever thought they needed such a thing in their life, but it exists. It's out there if you want it. So we have this concept of what belongs in New England food that was made in resistance to the immigrants, rather not resistance, just without any regard to a lot of the people who actually lived in New England at the time. If you're writing about New England food in late 19th century, you wouldn't be writing about creamed codfish. You'd be writing about salt pork and beans. You'd probably be writing about corned beef and cabbage, a version of which shows up as New England boiled dinner. You'd be eating about bread, fried chops, gingerbread. If you look at the dietaries that social workers wrote down about what people who worked in the Lowell mills were eating, and also poor people in Boston, because there were a lot of social workers going out and seeing what poor immigrants were eating, because they were very concerned about nutrition of the people living there, for good reason. A lot of people weren't getting enough to eat. They're eating gingerbread. There were not Toll House cookies available at the time. It was a great way of getting calories, but this gingerbread seems to have fallen on the wayside. It's not included in lists of New England food today, even though when a lot of these ideas about New England food were being codified, it was popular. And I have a theory about that. I'm going to say it very quickly because I want to get this done with soon, because I know all of you are falling asleep because this is Zoom and Zoom is exhausting. After the Civil War, when immigrants started coming to New England, when the idea of the New England kitchen became such a fad, when the colonial revival started, when a lot of New Englanders started looking back to our colonial past to build houses, to design gardens, to talk about in print, but also when it came to food. People started looking for some sort of connection to our colonial past in their food too. And one of the things you see changing in cookbooks at that time is the attitude towards molasses. Before the Civil War, when you look at recipes for gingerbread in cookbooks, and there were a lot of them, and again, cookbooks are not the only record of eating in the past, and there are a lot of problems with them. I just want to respect that. I'm just using this as a single, you know, things like diaries, records of probate and things like that are an important other source. You can't rely on cookbooks alone because they're written by an audience for an audience. They're not necessarily what people do. But disclaimers aside, you see a change. Before the Civil War in New England, a lot of cookbooks had recipes for gingerbread, but made with sugar. Okay. Things like fairy gingerbread or gossamer gingerbread. You see a lot of words like that. They don't have any molasses in them at all. They're like gingers, cinnamon, stuff like that, mixed together with sugar and butter and flour and baked, and they're great. After the Civil War, you see more and more molasses in all the gingerbread recipes. And sort of like people thought that it didn't seem authentic if it had white sugar instead of molasses. Sugar also became a lot cheaper after the Civil War, so it's like, oh, that's something that those poor people put in their food. Well, molasses is far more authentic, far more New Englandy. It's a ingredient that seems to reek of authenticity. And at the same time, you also find the gingerbread starts to become much less popular in cookbooks over time. I think it's because people don't actually like the taste of molasses all that much compared to sugar, which is a much cleaner, sweeter, simpler sort of taste. It's not an acquired taste. Everybody likes sugar. It's just sweet. It excites you. So that's my personal explanation as to why gingerbread has disappeared, because it's a perfectly fine. Anyway, so we've inherited this vision of New England food from the past, which is filtered through ideas of what colonial people were eating, and that should be the same thing that represents New England in the late 19th century and seems to be drawn up through now into the 20th century. So here we are with lists of New England food that don't seem to actually reflect what people eat on a regular basis. What should we do about this? What should we be thinking of instead? We have a couple of candidates. I'm going to play you a brief recording about one. Some of you will recognize this. I'm going to share my screen and then we'll go. Okay. Whoops. Here we go.
Rhode Island, the ocean state, where our restaurant and fishing industry have been decimated by this pandemic, are lucky to have a governor, Gina Raimondo, whose program lets our fishermen sell their catches directly to the public, and our state appetizer, calamari, is available in all 50 states. The calamari comeback state of Rhode Island casts 1 vote for Bernie Sanders and 34 votes for the next president, Joe Biden.
Okay, so clearly there is a ninja vote for a calamari as representing New England, which is great. 54% of all the squid that was produced in the United States was landed in the Northeast and in Rhode Island produced 54% of the squid that was caught in the Northeast last year. They're really good at catching squid. But let me share with you another headline about this, which reflects a little bit of the problems that we have with the whole calamari business. So it reads, Rhode Island is the calamari comeback because all the other fish are dead. That's sort of a mean way of putting it, but Rhode Island has the same problem the rest of New England has when we talk about cod and New England seafood in general, which is that, you know, our fisheries have collapsed. in the past 50 years. In 1991, Rhode Island landed 3.8 million pounds of cod. That's a lot of cod. It's huge amounts of cod. 3 years later, thanks to overfishing and our changing climate, which is warming the waters, it went down to about 600,000 pounds. And last year, in 2019, Rhode Island caught just 16,000 pounds of codfish. So glad the calamari's there. I'm all about eating squid. It's a lovely thing, but it wouldn't be a calamari state if we hadn't already overfished everything, which is a problem around New England. We're supposed to be talking about seafood, but our water's been warming. The lobster harvests have been falling off. Harvests of all sorts of fish have been going down because of overfishing, poor fisheries management, and warming water. So, you know, a couple of the things on the list of stuff we're supposed to eat in New England are seafood, and that may not be true forever. So what can we have? What's safe? How long before we lose the squid? I don't know. It's pretty hard to lose squid, Ron Newman. What should we have as New England foods? What are things that people eat that's accessible to a lot of people? You know, a lot of people don't eat lobster because it's still kind of expensive. If you're trying to feed your kids, you don't give them lobster. What are things that everyone can enjoy that reflect the people who live here, the people who eat here, that we can agree on? Maybe we can't agree on, but here are some possibilities. I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so here are some proposals. No, not that, not yet. There we go. Okay, so first of all, in the center of everything, we have marshmallow fluff. It originated in Somerville. Fluffernutter sandwiches are beloved by everyone who can actually eat peanut butter, which is not everybody, but you could just have a fluff sandwich without the peanut butter and it would probably be just about as good. I'm not a fan of fluff, but I respect it. We have whoopie pies. You know, if you want a food to represent a region, it should be something you can find sold in gas stations. You can find whoopie pies pretty much everywhere in New England. They're soft, they're gushy, they're made with something vaguely like marshmallow fluff in the middle. People can afford it. People like them. Why not? Although supposedly there are some people who claim the Pennsylvania Dutch originated whoopie pies, but this photo is from Maine. It is the official Maine snack food, so go Maine. Fish sticks. These were invented by Gorton's fishermen, Gorton's Seafood, in the 1950s. They are a completely industrial product. They had to invent new methods of freezing and persuade supermarkets to buy special freezers to put them in to sell them to people who didn't want to cook. We are an industrial, urbanized area of the country, and this reflects our values of having old preserved food that was created somewhere else. That fish, that wasn't fished off New England. They were importing fish from Poland in the 1960s. It's from somewhere else, but people still work in the Gorton's family. The Gorton's factory up in Gloucester. A lot of them commute from East Boston. A lot of them are immigrants, like so much of New England. Why not? Up here on the right, we have pavochon, which is Puerto Rican style roast turkey. Puerto Ricans are not immigrants because they are United States citizens, but a lot of Puerto Rican migrants live in New England. I think my fingers were on the order of 900,000 people who claim ancestry in Puerto Rico live in the region. Last I checked, that's a lot of people. And there's some really good food going on there. You can see we have some tostones also, some fried plantains. You know, the New England turkey, we don't have to make Thanksgiving turkey the way somebody made it in 1870. We're allowed to change. We're allowed to have new traditions and ones that reflect, you know, thousands upon thousands of immigrants. That's a good idea. Lower right, I have a dish of callaloo. The reason I have it there is because I read about the New England Apple Orchard Cookbook published in 2016 and sort of paged through the contents and noticed that even though people from Jamaica make up the largest group of, by any ethnicity, of people working in New England apple orchards, there weren't any Jamaican recipes in there. There were things for things like Moroccan peach chicken, to use up peaches from the orchard, but there didn't seem to be anything that actually feeds the people who work in the apple orchard. So I included this. In farmers markets around Greater Boston, I've noticed some places that are growing apples actually selling callaloo and being sold by some of the people with Jamaican ancestry who've been working the orchards at the farmers market. So I think that's really cool. And there are many other possibilities. you know, when you go to the farmer's market, you see foods from Brazil, you see foods from Southeast Asia, you see food reflecting the Latinx population in New England, which I think makes up something like 10% of the people living here nowadays, but 0% of the foods listed on the typical list of New England foods. So my plea is for us to, you know, to talk about New England isn't just a bunch of white people making up a pretend kitchen in 1870. We live here now. There are a lot of us. We come from different places, and we don't have to keep on making the same things. Maybe we could come up with some food that other people in other states will want to make too, just like the nachos and jambalaya and all the other cool foods that other states have. Maybe we could do that too. And in closing, you can follow me on social media. I just want to eat more foods from more people all the time. And that is what I would like to do. And I'd especially like to go to restaurants again after COVID stops. So that's just a tiny, tiny bit of what my book is about. There's a lot more about things like boiled dinner and Johnny Appleseed and how much people in New England actually drank during the colonial period. And the answer is they drank a lot. And I'd love to take some questions if there are questions to be had. Adam, take it away.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much, Meg. I don't see any questions yet. If anybody has questions, please feel free to put them down in the Q&A there. But I see some things in the chat.
Okay.
Pamela Cooley asked, how about Succotash, Necco wafers, apple pie, and Toll House cookies?
Okay, so Toll House cookies, yes, those are from New England. It's interesting. I was actually looking up a story about Ruth Wakefield, the proprietor of the Toll House, recently. And this is not original to me, but the story is that she ran out of nuts to put in her cookies, so she threw chocolate in, and it didn't melt the way she thought it would, and it became this wonderful cookie. What a wonderful accident. And what's pointed out by an author is that Ruth Wakefield was a professional dietitian, and she gave talks about food, and she was running a restaurant and buying all the supplies for it. And it's really unlikely that she'd come up with the recipe by accident. She probably tested it extensively because she was that kind of a perfectionist person. So sure, Toll House cookies, I'll give us that. Boston cream pie, although there were recipes for cream pies that are, oh, sorry, back up. Boston cream pie, what is Boston cream pie? Yellow cake, custard, yellow cake, chocolate stuff on top. These existed before the Boston cream pie did. You can find recipes from like 12 years before the Parker House introduced it that are almost exactly the same without the chocolate on top. So sure, let's do that. I'm trying to, there's so many comments. I'm trying to get back to Cooley's. Necco wafers. Necco wafers seem to be, weren't they out of production for a little while? Somebody in the chat should let me know what's going on about that. I thought they were coming back. Sure, they're regional food. They make great poker chips. You can hand them to the children at Halloween. They bring them home. You can hand them out the next year again because they never go stale. Why not? Apple pie. They had apple pie in England. They have apple pie in France, except it's upside down and you have to flip it, part to tan. How do you feel about New England foods being foods that aren't actually unique to here? You know, there's, you know, we have Italian people living in New England, but a lot of the foods that they make in the North End of restaurants are things that are also made by Italian Americans in Chicago, in New Orleans, in New York. So, you know, if you want to have a regional identity, and I didn't talk about this much because I just forgot about it. New England's huge. It's really different up in Madawaska, Maine, up near the Canadian border from New Haven, Connecticut, just climatically and the things they have access to. I'm not convinced that New England food is actually a useful kind of way of thinking about things at all at this point. Succotash, sorry, I want to answer all of Pamela's things. Succotash is, you know, both the European colonists and the Eastern Woodland peoples who spoke Algonquin, because there were a lot of different people with different names, with different traditions living in sort of the Eastern Massachusetts near the coast. Everybody cooked beans and corn together. It's just the easiest way to make corn palatable. Basically, what you're talking about when you're talking about what the Pilgrims ate versus up to like 1650, 1660, sometime when people started having more time to make food. You put a kettle on the fire, you put water into it, you throw in beans, you throw in a grain. If you have meat, you throw it into. If you have vegetables, sure, throw that in, and you cook it all day, and it's called pottage. And you eat it to survive, and it's not pleasant or fun, you know. Peas porridge hot and peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the hot 9 days old. That's pottage they're talking about. That's what people were cooking back then. That's a large extent what the people who were already here, the Pilgrims and the Puritans encountered, were cooking, because they'd gotten ship's kettles for the past 100 years by trading with the Europeans who came down through. Remember, when the European settlers got here, it wasn't like untouched wilderness. You know, they met Squanto, who had already been kidnapped and made his way back from England before when they arrived. So I don't know how much of a good representative of New England food succotash is, because that's another thing where I don't see recipes being posted. I don't see it in restaurants. I don't see cans of it in the supermarket. There may be an underground succotash club out there, but it seems like one of those things that was popular a while ago because it felt like it was identified with the Native Americans. Like it felt like it was tied to the past, that people don't seem to feel the need of that identity anymore. But I could be wrong. You know, I'm talking off the fly because I haven't researched it. I'd love to research succotash. Okay, I'm scrolling down and trying to get to something. Parker House rolls. Sure, I'll give you Parker House rolls. Yeah, they're good. Let's make more Parker House rolls. I think that'd be great. Albert Lafarge asks, how does New England chowder hold up against Manhattan, Rhode Island, or others in terms of popularity in the US?
That's a good one.
So, I don't know. New England chowder is promoted a lot of places because if you have to have something that represents a state or a region, it's one of the things people recognize and actually eat. You know, it's a perfectly nice soup. It works. Tastes like clams. Clams are good. Rhode Island clam chowder is probably not that common because nobody has any idea what it is. I know what it is. I mean, I've had it before. I actually like it better because it's really easy to come up with a really gluey clam chowder. You saw the thing about the savory latte earlier. Manhattan clam chowder, well, Manhattan is pretty big. I mean, the more people living in New York City there are in the entire state of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and probably Connecticut combined. So, I don't know, Albert. I mean, I have to look at things like canned soup sales. I'm not sure how to directly measure how popular it is. I mean, you could look at how many cookbooks it in, how many recipes, Google search histories for these things. But again, I don't think clam chowder is really a top of mind kind of recipe in the United States right now. You know, chocolate chip cookie, you're going to find like 5 gazillion, jillion text results. Clam chowder, it's kind of not a priority for a lot of people. Clams are not a priority for a lot of people. A lot of people are allergic. Okay, fried dough. You know, comes out of the category of things that people make at fairs where Italian Americans are all over the United States. And if you want to claim that identity for New England, sure. There are tons of Italians in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island, but not so many when you get up to the, you know, the white belt up north.
About apple cider donuts. That's from Francine.
Sure, I like apples. People like apple cider donuts. They're sold everywhere. They eat them. I think that would be a fine New England food. And I'd very happily kick Indian pudding off the list just for apple cider donuts. Kristen Cobbler. Why not? Those are good things too. Talk to all those people who write those little articles like a AAA magazine and tell them that they're wrong about these things. They should definitely have apple crisp. Okay. Necco wafers are back. Thank you, Stephen Oakland. Necco wafers are gone. Wait a minute. I'm seeing conflicting. Okay. Necco wafers folded. Yeah, okay. Stephen Oakland saw them for sale at Walgreens. Okay, well, Moxie.
Looks like they're back again under a new recipe. Someone new is making them who bought the company.
Okay. Sure. You know, does candy count as food? Because I haven't really been talking about that stuff. I mean, there's maple candy. People like that too. At least the creamy stuff as opposed to the hard-boiled sweets. What about Moxie, Leslie McPherson? You got some Moxie for me? That hasn't shown the ability, I mean, it barely finds in Massachusetts, you know, much less any other place outside of the region. New England, I don't know if they're particularly talented making ice cream. We sure eat a lot of it. You know, you're thinking of Toscanini's, Michelle Houbenko, but You know, there's also, we did the Ben and Jerry's whole peace, love, Vermont ice cream thing. You know, back in the 1980s, there was like an ice cream store every 10 feet in Harvard Square. We seem to be past that moment and gone, we've even passed the cupcake moment. I'm not sure what the next food is that's going to be sweet, but I bet it's not going to be Indian pudding. Brown bread in a can. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it's basically a molasses muffin, which I think is another reason it has not penetrated the rest of the United States. You know, what can we use to colonize? You know, we are the first colonists here, man. Well, second colonists because there was Virginia, but we're some of the first colonists in the country out here. We should have a food that takes over the rest of the country. And yes, we are definitely past the frozen yogurt stage versus. Thank you for noting that in the chat. So apples, whoopie pies, apple whoopie pies, you know, if you guys want to spread out in the United States, you might want to consider that possibility, although pumpkin spice whoopie pies already exist. They're probably already out there. My grandparents never met an industrial food product they didn't like. Maybe we should just own that. Yes, Jody G, I absolutely agree with you. My grandmother cooked tamale pie made with Bisquick and tuna noodle casserole. And that is the industrial heritage, which a lot of us share. You know, most people in most of the populated America, parts of New England didn't grow up on a farm where you could just go out and pick a tomato and have a lovely dinner made out of that and your fresh mozzarella cheese or something like that. We grew up in the suburbs, we grew up in the cities, we grew up shopping at air-conditioned supermarkets where you can't smell the food, where the melons just smell like they might as well be baseballs. You know, we grew up without that immediate sensory input. And so we eat industrial food. It's old, it's prepackaged, it's made so it doesn't spoil, it's barely biological, but that's us. You know, this is who we are, and we should own that. And more fluff, you know, stuff made with fluff. The Fluff Festival in Somerville is a fine example of extending and adapting what is our culture nowadays. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. Not everybody lives out, you know, where you can pick a fresh watermelon. You can't grow watermelons that well in New England, although Piccadilly Farm is doing a very fine job right now. Yes, hurrah for fluff. Yay, fluff. Okay, fluff seems to be the universal New England food. So but those of you who've lived outside the region know that fluffernutters are not necessarily familiar to people who grew up in places like Missouri. So I expect all of you to become fluff evangelists, to bring the good news to the rest of the country that you can make a peanut butter sandwich that's even less healthy for you than eating jelly. A little tiny bit of fruit material in it.
This is a good last one, I think. New England pierogies. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Which pierogies?
New England pierogies.
Yes, yes. Oh my God. Patty's pierogies. I meant to have a slide about that. None Fall River. You can buy pierogies with any filling you want in them, including French Canadian tourtière. I didn't even talk about French Canadians in this talk and just how much influence they should be having over our food habits, given that 500,000 people came to New England between 1880 and 1920. You can get it with buffalo chicken. You can get it with Portuguese chorizo. You can get Tex-Mex stuff. Patty's pierogies, gotta go. Yes, John Newman, I'm gonna answer one more question, Adam. My book does talk about Greek pizza, which is a regional specialty here. That's one way of putting it. A side effect of my growing up in New Jersey is that New England pizza was a different experience for me than the pizza I grew up with. And I'm going to respect everyone's culture. It's made differently. Okay, it's made in a pan. It's not usually made in a wood-fired oven. The dough has things like milk and butter and eggs in it, which is not true of the Italian pizza. So it's a different, it's more biscuity as opposed to bread experience. The cheese that's put on top is usually a mixture of mozzarella and cheddar. So it's more oily, it's more biscuity. It's just not the same as the pizza you get if you grew up in New Jersey, New York. And I can't say anything more about it because it's too painful. I just can't talk about this topic. But yes, I do talk about Greek pizza in my book and why that's a thing in New England. And it is. Basically, anytime you see something with the word house of pizza, that's a Greek pizza house. Greek immigrants started in Connecticut and then expanded all the way up through New Hampshire and Maine, starting in the 1960s and 70s. And I talk about that in the book. Yes, pizza wars. This is good. Anyway, I'm sure you all have other things to do.